We're continuing this series called Intelligent Design, and this is a Christian apologetics series that we're doing. Now, Christian apologetics is where you study reasoned arguments and evidence that support or justify the Christian faith. And no one over the course of probably the last 50 years, maybe very few people anyway, who've had a stronger voice over that time frame for this idea of Christian apologetics than a guy by the name of Josh McDowell. Todd referenced a book of his last week, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Probably one of the best books, if not the best book, second only to the Bible in my life, was that book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. If you've never read it or had an opportunity, I'd strongly recommend you get a copy of it. There's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, then more Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and now they've got the new updated Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It's just a packed resource filled with all kinds of information and data that is very, very insightful and very supportive of what the kingdom of God is about. So I hope you'll get a copy of that. Josh McDowell was not a Christian when he started on this journey to disprove Christianity. He writes about this in a number of his books, but in the account of the book, The Resurrection Factor, he shares these words. I'm going to share just a little bit of his testimony with you. He said, "I thought Christianity was a farce. I thought most Christians were walking idiots." He said, "I've met some. I thought that if a Christian had a brain cell, it would die of loneliness." He said, "I just didn't know any better." Very harsh. But Josh met some people while he was in college, while he was at the university. He met a couple professors, a number of students there that continued to challenge him. Hey, take a look at the evidence. Look at the evidence about Jesus. If you look at the evidence, continuing to encourage him to do that. And finally, he took him up on that offer. And this is what he writes about. He said, "I did it out of pride to refute them. I didn't know there were facts. I didn't know there was evidence a person could evaluate with his mind. After much study and research, my mind finally came to the conclusion that Jesus must have been who he claimed to be. When I couldn't refute it, I ended up becoming a Christian." The Bible had its part in Josh's journey to Christ, but it was the evidence, it was the facts that really drove him to understand who Jesus was. This is what he said about his research in his pursuit to find the truth. "One of the crucial areas of my research to refute Christianity centered around the resurrection. After more than 1,000 hours of studying this subject and thoroughly investigating its foundation, I was forced to the conclusion that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is either one of the most wicked, heartless, vicious hoaxes ever foisted upon the minds of men, or it is the most fantastic fact of history. It is either history's greatest delusion or the greatest miracle that history records." Josh McDowell makes a very strong point, and he's right. The resurrection is the linchpin of the gospel. It's the linchpin of this story about the life of Jesus, the truth. It is the linchpin. Now, some of you may not know what a linchpin is. A linchpin is a fastener that's used. Originally, it was designed to hold a wheel or any other parts from sliding off of an axle. Some of you might use a linchpin like this to secure the trailer hitch on your whatever it is you're pulling with your vehicle. The figurative usage of the word linchpin is referring to something or someone who holds all the pieces of a complicated structure together. The linchpin is that key piece that if it's not there, nothing works. And the gospel, the linchpin to the gospel is the resurrection. If you can disprove that the resurrection did not happen, you can disprove the gospel. The gospel doesn't work without this linchpin of the resurrection. In fact, the resurrection answers this very vital question, and that is Christianity valid? And if the resurrection is true, the answer to that question is absolutely yes. As a Christian, the claim that Jesus rose from the dead is that crucial part. It keeps it all together. Listen to what the Apostle Paul says about this in his letter to the Corinthians. He said, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. if the resurrection is not true, then most everything else that Jesus said basically has no potency to it, no power to it, no value to it. It doesn't carry any weight. But because the resurrection is true, Jesus is the sole means of salvation for mankind. When Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me, that statement has significant power and authority because the resurrection was true. So the Bible claims the resurrection is factual, and we would expect that, right? The Bible is going to support its own narrative. But the big question is there other evidence that would merit us believing or trusting in the belief that the resurrection is true? And I'm glad you asked that, because that's what we're going to look at this morning. We're going to look at six pieces of evidence that validate the resurrection. All right? So the first one is this. Jesus actually predicted his own resurrection from the dead. Jesus predicted his own resurrection from the dead. Dr. Wilbur M. Smith, highly decorated educator. He was a professor at Moody Bible Institute, Fuller Theological Seminary, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He writes about Jesus predicting his own resurrection. He writes about this. This is what he says. It was the same Jesus, the Christ, who, among many other remarkable things, said and repeated something which, proceeding from any other being, would have condemned him at once as either a bloated egotist or a dangerously unbalanced person. That Jesus said he was going up to Jerusalem to die is not so remarkable, though all the details he gave about that death, weeks and months before he died, are together a prophetic phenomenon. But when he said that he himself would rise again from the dead the third day after he was crucified, he said something that only a fool would dare say if he expected longer the devotion of any disciples, unless he was sure he was going to rise. No founder of any world religion known to man ever dared say a thing like this. Jesus actually predicted that 3 days after his death, he would rise again. And that is an absolutely crazy statement to make unless you can back it up. And if you can back it up, then it becomes one of the most amazing things a person could ever claim. Now, the Bible has quite the narrative on Jesus' life. We have 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We call them the 4 Gospels. And they record Jesus' life from 4 different individuals' perspective. All 4 of them document that Jesus, he readily referenced his resurrection, that he would die and come back to life. Let me give you one example found in Matthew. There's a number of examples throughout all 4 of these Gospels. This is what Matthew records in Matthew 16. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life. Jesus predicted his own resurrection from the dead in a real straightforward manner. What's interesting about it was that his disciples had a difficult time ascertaining what his message was. They were having a hard time letting this sink in and them gain a sense of grasp of what he was talking about. Ironically, the Jews at that time took his claims very seriously. And when he had died, they took some significant measures that we'll look at here in a minute to secure his tomb, so that, because they were really concerned about him resurrecting. Isn't that kind of interesting? That his own followers didn't know what he was talking about, but his enemies took great care in seeing that he didn't resurrect from the dead. Which leads us to the second point that we want to look at. The second piece of evidence. Some of you may find this a little bit odd, but it's the piece of evidence that Jesus actually died. Now, why is that important? Well, some people who are trying to explain away the resurrection, they speculate that Jesus didn't actually die during his crucifixion. That somehow he survived it, and then he was able to escape, and thus give this perspective that he had risen from the dead. The Roman philosopher Cicero says this about crucifixion. He says, "The most cruel and hideous of tortures most cruel and hideous of tortures. William Durant, well-known great historian, said even the Romans pitied their victims, those who were crucified. We don't need to doubt that the security precautions that were taken by the Romans to ensure that Jesus died on the cross were effective or efficient. They were. In fact, Jesus was definitely dead. History does not doubt that fact. Dr. Gary Habermas points out that there are significant evidences of Jesus' death found in non-biblical sources. For instance, in the first century, the writer Cornelius Tacitus, who's considered by many to be the greatest ancient Roman historian of all time, he records that Jesus died. Also, the Jewish scholar and historian Josephus, he records. He's also a first century contemporary of Tacitus. As well as the Jewish Talmud also records that Jesus had died. There's virtually no doubt that Jesus went to the cross, and while on the cross, he died. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that we don't have any of those references. We can still know for a fact that Jesus died on the cross. And the reason for that is the Romans were experts at execution by crucifixion. If you were nailed to a cross by the Romans, you died on that cross. They saw to it. That was why the two thieves on either side of Jesus had their legs broken, because they were trying to speed up the death process. The Romans were experts at executing people through crucifixion. So Jesus was dead. Some may want to speculate that he somehow survived, but no one ever survived a Roman crucifixion. The third piece of evidence that we have is the security precautions that were made at the tomb of Jesus. Jesus' predictions, as I mentioned, about his resurrection were well known, not just among his followers, but also among those who opposed him. And the Jewish and Roman leadership feared that Jesus' followers would come and try to steal his body, thus creating this persona that he had risen from the dead. So they took some significant measures to see that that didn't happen. The first thing that they did was they posted a Roman guard at his tomb. Now, we're not talking about, Barney Fife security guard, with a flashlight. Not at all. The guard unit that was posted there was part of what was known as a Roman legion. Probably one of the greatest offensive and defensive fighting machines ever devised. In the 4th century, there's a historian, a military historian, who writes about the Roman army and its disciplines. A guy by the name of Flavius Vegetius Renatus. You can say that over and over again a couple times. Vegetius writes this: victory in war does not depend early upon numbers of mere courage. Only skill and discipline will ensure it. We find that the Romans owed the conquest of the world to none other cause than continual military training, exact observance of discipline in their camps, and unwearied cultivation of the other arts of war. The discipline and the training in the Roman army was so important. It was a vital piece of what the Roman army saw as a key to their success. A Roman guard was highly disciplined and highly trained, and it was made up of as many as 4 all the way up to 16 men in that security force. Each man was trained to protect 6 feet. If you had a guard of 16, they often would square up, 4 on each side. And those men were trained to guard 36 square yards of real estate. And they could do it even if a battalion assaulted them. They were trained to defend that position. That's who was guarding the tomb of Jesus. Some of the best fighting men in the world at that time. But that wasn't the only thing that was there. They took another step, another measure to secure his tomb. The Roman guard had been somewhat driven off of their point. Something happened significantly that caused them to leave their post. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, no one ever left a guard post as a Roman soldier because the punishment was death. The most common form of execution was they would strip that soldier of his clothes and they would actually execute him in a fire that was started with his own uniform. Dr. George Curie, who studied Roman military discipline, said this about the fear of punishment produced flawless attention to duty, especially in the night watches. You can imagine if you were going to be executed, if you fell asleep or abandoned your post. The history of Roman discipline and security testifies to the fact that if the tomb were not empty, those soldiers would not have left their post, nor would they have gone to the high priest looking for help. The fear of the death penalty meant that they paid immense attention to even the most minute of detail when they are on guard duty. But we read in Matthew the 28th chapter, we read that they do leave. It says some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that happened. Everything that happened. They were talking about the tomb being empty and trying to explain the resurrection to the high priest. They went to the high priest probably because he had some pull with the Roman authorities. And this was possibly the only way that these soldiers can save their necks from execution. The high priest offers them a bribe. He gave them money and he told them to say, here's your story. You'll tell everyone that you fell asleep while you were on your post. And that the disciples came and they were able to move that 1 ton or 1.5 ton stone without waking you up. And then after they moved the stone and broke the seal, they took Jesus, his dead body. They took him away. That's what you should tell everyone. And then when Pilate finds out about this story, don't worry about it. I'll explain to him on your behalf to spare you from execution. They had gone to great lengths to secure the tomb, only to have it empty. There was another piece of security that they put into place. It was called the Roman seal. The Roman seal. We read about it in Matthew, the 27th chapter. It says this. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. The soldiers would have examined the tomb, made sure that the body was where it was supposed to be. Then they roll this huge stone into place to secure the tomb. And then what they would have done was stretch a cord of twine or rope across the front of that tomb, across the front of that stone, securing the tomb. And then they would have anchored it into the sides of the walls of the tomb itself with clay. And then they would have taken a seal, a signet of the Roman governor, and they would have pressed that into that fresh clay. The official seal of the governor in times of, antiquity were used to authenticate things, to make sure that it was genuine. It would be what we might call a seal of authenticity. The seal at Jesus' tomb, it validated that Jesus' body was actually in the tomb. And not only did it do that, but it also verified the fact that that body, being protected by a Roman guard, was protected by the full power and authority of the Roman Empire. Anybody who would have tried to move the stone would have broken that seal. And thus they would have incurred the wrath of Roman law and power. And do you know what the punishment for breaking a Roman seal, an official seal, was? It was death by crucifixion upside down on the spot. People feared the breaking of an official seal. It was unlikely that Jesus' disciples were in any way, shape, or form ready to take on that they would risk execution. In fact, if you look at the story from Scripture of what's going on in their lives at this moment, they're terrified. They're showing incredible fear and cowardice. In fact, you remember when Jesus was actually on trial, Peter, one of his closest friends, was asked, do you even know this guy? And 3 times he denies it. Why did he do that? Because he was afraid. He was afraid. It doesn't look like the behavior of a bunch of guys who are willing to risk their death to steal the dead body of their friend just to keep a lie alive. Well, they took great great measures to secure the tomb. Great measures. And it's kind of interesting that they went to such a degree, such a length, to secure the tomb of a dead man. But those security measures actually work to show the resurrection has significant truth. Those measures were put in place to keep the tomb secure. The resurrection overwhelmed it. There's another piece of evidence that's very important, and that is the evidence of eyewitness testimonies. Thomas is one of Jesus' 12 followers, one of his closest 12, and he had doubts about Jesus' resurrection. In fact, because of this one event in his life, he is known today as Doubting Thomas. Just this one event. Be careful what people know about you. They may tag you for all eternity, right? Well, he had doubts because when Jesus first appeared to the disciples, Thomas wasn't with them. He appeared to the others, but Thomas was absent. We read about this in John, the 20th chapter. He says, John writes this, "So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe.'" A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Thomas didn't believe until he saw, and then he believed. There were a number of events where Jesus appeared alive to people following the actual resurrection on that first Easter Sunday. One of the most significant of these events, the Apostle Paul records in a letter that he sent to the church in Corinth, his very first letter. Listen to what he writes. "After that, he," talking about Jesus, "appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." Dr. Edwin Yamachi, who's a professor of history at the University of Miami in Oxford, Ohio, he writes this about this specific sighting and Paul's reference to it. He says, "What gives a special authority to the list of witnesses as historical evidence is the reference to most of the 500 brethren being still alive. St. Paul says, in effect, 'If you do not believe me, you can ask them.' Such a statement in an admittedly genuine letter written within 30 years of the event is almost as strong an evidence as one could hope to get for something that happened nearly 2,000 years ago." What Paul was saying was this: I believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but if you don't believe me, you should talk to some of the 500 who are still alive. Think about that for a second. If we were to have amassed all 500 of those people and brought them into a court of law type setting, you could, if each one of those just had given 6 minutes of eyewitness testimony, you would have 50 hours of firsthand eyewitness testimony of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But some would say, yeah, but all those people, they're on board. You know, they were favorable to Jesus, therefore they're going to believe. Is it possible that 500 people could ever agree on any one thing? That they could all be proponents of the same lie? Probably not. But let's just assume that they could. There's a fifth piece of evidence, and that is what is called the hostile eyewitnesses. There are other witnesses to this event that were hostile. Another reason for the validity of the resurrection is that this story was circulated in the presence of knowledgeable people who were extremely hostile to the Christian movement concerning the value of a hostile witness, okay? We look at what the hostile witness brings to the table of evidence. The law professor, Dr. John Montgomery, writes about that. He says this rule of the hostile witness underscores the reliability of testimony to Christ's resurrection, which was presented contemporaneously in the synagogues. in the very teeth of the opposition, among hostile cross-examiners who would certainly have destroyed the case for Christianity had the facts been otherwise. What is Dr. Montgomery saying? He's saying if they had had the goods, they would have spilled it. They would have showed it. They would have presented it. But they're surprisingly silent. Let me illustrate it this way. When I was growing up, I have two sisters, and my sisters, both younger than me, they took it upon themselves to be, truth tellers to my parents of all the things that I did wrong. I don't know if you had a sibling like that or siblings like that. It was very troubling to me. They felt like they were doing my parents a service by sharing with them all the things that I did wrong. And they were really good at presenting them at the right moment. For instance, one night during dinner, my one sister announces, "Mom, Dad, you should ask Monty why he was in the principal's office today." What? Well, I'm like, what are you talking about? Why were you in the principal's office today? It was a very bad day for me. I just want to tell you, okay? That night, very bad. That's what a hostile witness does. If they have evidence, they'll present it at the most appropriate time. And the truth is that those who oppose Christianity, if they had had the evidence, they would have shared it. But there is no record of it. Their silence is duly noted. In fact, someone said their silence is deafening. An empty tomb, which was just about a 15-minute walk from the center of Jerusalem, actually confirmed the truth of what happened. Professor Paul Alphus of the University of Erlangen in Germany said this: "The resurrection could not have been maintained in Jerusalem for a single day, for a single hour," he says, "if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all concerned." If the events about Jesus were as widely known as we believe them to be, and those hostile to this new faith could not refute the facts about it, it gives enormous credibility to the truth of the resurrection. If they couldn't, and they couldn't, and if they had the information and they didn't share it, then there's probably some real legitimate reality to what had happened. The tomb was empty because Jesus came back from the dead. Now, some would say there are other reasons for that. There are other explanations, and there are a number of theories that people have developed over the centuries. But the truth is this: probably the most important, convincing piece of evidence is the sixth piece of evidence we're going to look at. And again, we're only scratching the surface this morning. The sixth piece of evidence, though, is probably the most powerful. That is the martyrdom or the death of the disciples, Jesus' followers. Now, this whole story starts, just to give us a little bit of context, it starts in John, the 20th chapter. Look what John writes in the very first part of verse 19. On the evening of the first day of the week, this is the evening of his resurrection, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders. They're terrified. These guys have just seen their leader executed 3 days earlier. Now there's rumors that he's alive. The women had seen him that morning. There's rumors that he is alive. And they're in the upper room. They are locked away behind locked doors because they fear if they killed Jesus, who would be next? Logically, it would be them. If they're trying to eliminate this movement, these would be the guys that would be eliminated next. But something happened that was so dramatic that it transformed the lives of these 11 men so that 10 of them, with the exception of John, the other 10 would die martyrs' deaths. Transformational. What was it? They had seen the resurrected Savior. It changed everything. They went from men who were afraid to men who would die for this cause. These guys didn't go to Rome or to Athens to preach Jesus crucified. They went right back into the very city of Jerusalem. where had their message or their teachings been false, this message would have been derailed and disproved. But the resurrection could not have been maintained in that city for even a moment's time had the tomb not been empty. What happened in Jerusalem after that first Easter, the Resurrection Sunday, what happened couldn't have happened if the tomb wasn't empty. You see, the Jewish leaders would have done a little field trip. They would have gone over to the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and they would have said, here, evidence A, the body of Jesus. The problem is they couldn't do that because the tomb was empty. The official explanation by the Jews was that his body was stolen by his followers. That in itself is an admission that the tomb was empty. Chuck Colson summarizes this better than anybody else, and I've read a ton about this. Chuck Colson was the White House counsel of the Nixon administration, and he went to prison because of the Watergate scandal. And he writes this about it. He said, I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proves it. How? Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. And you're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. The disciples went to their graves with this conviction that Jesus had risen from the dead. That piece of information is powerful, powerful testimony. It's nearly impossible to even believe that they would have died martyrs' deaths for a lie. But it's not impossible to believe that they would die so that everyone would know about the resurrected Jesus. You see, the entire reputation of Jesus rises and falls on the resurrection. The whole gospel rises and falls on the resurrection. And there is more than enough evidence to believe that Jesus came back to life. Don't take what I say this morning. There's a whole lot more out there. Please get a copy of Josh's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and do your own study if you're still a skeptic. It's okay, but don't leave it and say, I don't believe it. Pursue it. Be convinced that it isn't true. I believe the evidence is there. But just believing that he rose from the dead, it's not enough. It really isn't. In fact, in Acts, the 4th chapter, Luke tells us this. Salvation is found in no one else, for there's no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. You can believe the resurrection and still not be part of the family of God and miss out on heaven. You have to take a step in the direction where the evidence is pointing, that Jesus is the forgiver and the Lord and the Savior. You have to accept him, put your faith and trust in him. He took that step, and when he rose from the dead, he proved that he was the Son of God. Who else could have come back from the dead? He proved that all of these promises now are bankable. The one where he says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Put your confidence in him, he said. He'll save you from your sin. He'll save you from eternity in hell. But it's not just believing in the resurrection. It's actually putting your faith and trust in the one who rose from the dead. If you've never taken that step before, look at the evidence. And then put your faith in him. Let's pray. God, we love you. We thank you for the immense sacrifice you made so that we would know you and have a relationship with you, that our sins could be forgiven and we could have that promise, be part of your family for all eternity. Lord, I know that there are people who are here this morning who've never taken that step. And I pray, God, that you would speak to their heart today. They would not leave here missing that one piece of vital information that shows the gospel is true, the resurrection is alive. Jesus came back from the dead. God, help us all to know that and to share that. I pray this in Jesus' life-changing, resurrected from the dead name. And all God's people said, amen. If you've never taken that step before, this morning is that day. I want to encourage you to do that. We've got some areas in the back of our auditorium designated for prayer. Just make your way at any time during the remainder of this service. We'd love to talk with you about taking that step. Let's stand together and let's worship. Come if you have a decision.